Well, it takes more energy to make 1 kilogram of paper than 1 kilogram of steel. If you have to print something, you should switch your font from Arial to Century Gothic, because with that you can save 30% ink. And if all people worldwide switched to energy-efficient light bulbs, we could save a total of 105 billion euros per year. Well, small hacks can make our life more sustainable. Just small hacks, though, aren't enough to switch and change a whole sector or a whole economy system. Therefore, you need smart ideas, strategies, good products, and of course, good solutions to make the life of the customers easier and make it easier to live sustainably. So how can we enhance sustainability in the finance sector? What players and products are fundamental for the change, and which aspects should be crucial in terms of investment? That's what our next session and topic is all about. So welcome to the stage Melina, Sánchez, Carsten Traum and Katharina Beck, and our host of the session, Gustav Speth.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Yeah, we just switched to the seating order again, spontaneously. But yeah, welcome from my side as well. I want to introduce our panel, and you see we've had a switch as well here, and I'm very glad to have Elisabeth Weisswange from Deutsche Kreditbank today here. You are the head of EU affairs at DKB. I think DKB is one of the largest financial institutions sponsoring sustainable technology in the end. And that's why I'm very happy that you are here today. Next to me, I have Katharina Beck. Katharina, you are the spokesperson for financial politics of the Green Party. And according to you, Germany should be front runner with regard to sustainable finance and needs to focus on digitalization as an enabler for reducing emissions. I'm very glad to have you here. And to my left, we have Melina Sánchez from the impact fund Aenu. You are principal and vice president impact there. And yes, I think we have a very nice round here today from an impact fund, a corporate, and also politics here. So really a round to discuss the important things on sustainability. Sustainability and responsibility as well. Those are two of the main topics we are focusing today at the Digital Finance Conference. And today morning I read an article in the Tagesspiegel, which was on 10 signals giving hope for climate and for a sustainable future. And one of the very nice signals is that financial industry is one of the things spending hope for us. I want to start with the topic of regulation. And in my readings before this panel, there are so many different regulations on the European level, on German level, different kinds of acts. And I want to start with you, Melina. Which of those acts in the end are most important for you when it comes to investing in sustainable assets?
Yeah, glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation. From a regulatory perspective, there are two main frameworks that apply to us as a climate/impact venture capital fund. First is SFDR, which is a framework for Article 6, 8, 9, so classifying how impactful a financial institution is. And then also the EU taxonomy, classifying also for our investments, our portfolio companies, the different sustainability objectives. So those are the more direct frameworks that apply to us, but indirectly also as our companies grow, and specifically Aenu as an early stage investor, we invest in companies that have very few employees, but eventually will grow and become hopefully big companies and potentially also IPO. There are other regulations that will apply to those companies, like now NFRD, in the future CSRD. Don't ask me how They are called Teamful. We always use the acronyms, but those are some of the regulations that are closest to our work.
And Elisabeth, are those the same important for you as well?
Definitely, yeah. Those apply to us as well, and we work very hard to comply with them. And I'm actually in the public affairs department, so I monitor the regulation very closely. And also from my side, thank you so much for having me today. And there's actually so many regulations that sometimes we just throw around those shortcuts. And besides the ones that Melina mentions or just mentioned, I just quickly want to mention two more that are quite relevant and they have not been concluded yet, and one is green claims. So the European Commission has started to introduce a proposal quite recently on measures to clarify environmental labels on products, but also on claims. So every claim that a company will make on sustainability in the future needs to be substantiated, which is quite difficult, I think, and we are still, I think everyone's still figuring out what the clear definitions are. So that's something that we're looking forward to look at. And another one is obviously due diligence as well. On the German side, we already have the law. And then on EU level, the famous CSDDD. I thought it was very interesting about the debate if the financial sector will be included or not. And just recently, the legal committee of the European Parliament has decided to include it to a certain extent. Here again, we wait for the very clear definitions. So it's a lot of regulations that we have to follow because otherwise we fall back. And also for us, it's really important to be in the forefront because, you know, if something happens within a week and you miss it, that just can't be the case. And maybe just briefly with regards to the taxonomy, it's something that we regard as highly important and we struggle with it a little bit. Just, you know, putting out the keyword green asset ratio here, but I'm happy to say a little bit more on that later. I don't know if that's already the time for that, but I just briefly wanted to mention that that's obviously the top priority. Yeah.
There will be time for the green asset ratio. I'm sure about that. One question directly ahead. You talked about definitions, especially in the context of green claims. Is that enough already to combat greenwashing in the end, or do we need still more? What do you think? What's your opinion?
I think it's really difficult to combat something that's, you know, very difficult to grasp as well. I think it's great when politics come forward with a proposal. The danger is always to have a huge burden of bureaucracy. And that's always the two sides, I think, that are fighting against each other, you know, to fight greenwashing, but then you also fight the flow of things by introducing huge rules that no one can comply with. So yeah, I think it's great that we have all these proposals, and I'm a big fan of EU regulation. Might sound a bit weird, but I do think that's the thing that brings us forward together as the European Union. However, companies, the industry, they need to be able to, you know, be up to speed, and they need to be able to do it, and some companies might not have the man or woman power to. So is it enough? I would say not just yet, but we're getting there.
So one fan for EU regulation, Katharina. We have you as part of the German Parliament and part, of course, one of the governing parties here. What's your thought on, are you a fan as well of EU regulation, of sustainable finance regulation as we have it so far?
Maybe it's an interesting role switch because Yes, I'm a fan that we proceed in regards of standardizing. At least we are on the way in standardizing what sustainability might mean with regards to the definitions. And on the other hand, I do observe that there are several pitfalls currently still there. So what I really like is that we get to a very simple understanding what sustainability could mean with the taxonomy. So they have 4 criteria, but the first 2 are the most important one. And the first criterion is do no significant harm. So if you don't wastes on some of the planetary boundaries, if you don't destroy anything and you're, let's say, equal. That's the first criterion. And the second criterion is have at least one substantial positive contribution. So you change something for the better. You have somehow an impact. And I really like this definition. It's really easy. Don't do something bad and do something good. You don't have to do everything of the goodish things that are there. You don't have to do climate and biodiversity and. You can do one thing that is better than the zero baseline. So, yeah, and then you are on a sustainable path. So that's quite simple. And then I see it a little bit, I'm also a fan that we are progressing, yet on the other hand, when we look into the details, like the green asset ratio, there are problems as well. And right now we have a market problem because the green asset ratio would only include very large sustainable projects and not the smaller ones, not the wind farms, the renewable energy, the also smaller PV solar projects wouldn't be included. And some very sustainable banks or banks investing in very sustainable things would have very small green asset ratios and look really bad, even though they invest in many but smaller projects. So that's a market distortion in a way, favoring only large projects with regards to what we also need when we look into independency and decentralization, which is good, making us more independent also from supplies from states whom we don't want to cooperate that much anymore, for example. So we do have in the details some issues that need to be solved. And so this is maybe a bit maybe you see it similarly. So I'm a fan and
yeah, if I may just jump in, thank you so much for saying that, because maybe you've seen my speaking points, because that's exactly our position here as well. We have a huge problem with the green asset ratio because we try so much. We finance almost every wind farm in Eastern Germany and we can't put it in the green asset ratio. So it's just a shame because we don't think that it really shows the big picture. It's not very transparent, so to say. And I think another aspect is also that it doesn't lead to incentives. Like smaller banks, I don't think are incentivized by a green asset ratio like that. And that's a shame. And I do think that's something we need to address. And we are very actively trying to keep up the dialogue with the politicians because we are not the only ones that face that hurdle. Yeah.
Yeah, and there we have a bit of a conflict of interest that you also already addressed the bureaucracy or let's say effort with regards to then regulation. Because why is the regulation as it is? Because there has been a lot of lobbying in keeping small and medium enterprises out of the obligation to report on sustainability. Because there's another acronym that matters with regards to the taxonomy, and that is the CSRD. Because only if you are obliged to report, so Corporate Social Sustainability Reporting Directive, only if you're obliged to report, you can be part of the taxonomy. And only companies with more than 500 employees are obliged, and after 2026 with 250, but many small wind farms, etc., have less. So they are not obliged. This is less effort for them, but in a way now also a competitive disadvantage. And therefore, I think we need to roll up again the dialogue about, is there maybe, let's say, not everything you need to report in the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, but maybe the climate part, so CO2 reporting, might that make sense to harmonize as well for smaller companies? Wouldn't it be even not only the effort, but let's say in the cost-benefit analysis, a higher benefit to be part at least of the climate reporting? And I think this is where we need to continue the dialogue as well with the practice that sometimes I am being lobbied, sends mixed messages, right? So please change the green asset ratio thing, but don't do the more bureaucracy. It doesn't work. So if you want to be part, you need to provide the data. If we want to have data, companies need to provide the data. And that's the conflicts of interest I do feel and see all the bureaucracy things. Yeah. But maybe we can reduce other bureaucracy things that don't make sense anymore, that have been invented 20 years ago or so. But here, maybe we would need to put something new in. And that's a debate that I would find very fruitful, to come here to constructive results that have a fair market picture and not give privileges to larger projects alone.
Our perspective is a little bit different, also coming from a specific impact investing fund. As I said, we invest in companies that have 3 employees, 5 employees, 20 employees. And even if they are not officially part of the EU taxonomy, we have to comply with it through our SFDR regulation. There is no way that a startup that is that small will ever be able to report on EU taxonomy or on any other sustainability criteria when they barely have enough resources to keep the business going, right? So I think generally the regulation as is, SFDR, has the right direction, but it will never be a one-fits-all. And so when we open the chapter of should we, for example, have a smaller or narrower regulation or disclosure for smaller companies, it might actually not benefit a lot of other companies that, for example, would fall under the venture capital umbrella. So for us, regulation is an opportunity because we are also bringing more or channeling more money into the industry, but on the other hand, can be a burden for a smaller company. So just a counterpart of what you said, it can be good, it can be bad, depending on which types of companies we are talking about.
I think that's a really tricky question, and I think that's why it was excluded from the beginning, because the regulator also said it might be too much. What we would propose is an opt-in scenario where smaller companies, smaller projects can be included, can be counted in the green asset ratio, but they are not obliged to. Maybe that could be a compromise.
May I ask a question? To how would you then, if you want to be classified as a sustainable fund, let's say Article 9, you would need data to understand how the CO2 performance is, isn't it?
Absolutely.
So how would you address that? So I see the point, and how would you address it?
Well, so there are 2 things, right? There are the sustainability objectives, and obviously we have a very rigorous analysis on climate modeling, social modeling before we perform an investment, right? Which is actuals, but also projections. And then afterwards, when we make the investment, we track also the performance on the sustainability side from our startups. That's one thing. The other thing is around what we call ESG, which is also part of, to a certain extent, SFDR, part of the PIEs, the principal adverse impacts. And those are the ones that I find a little bit more tricky for smaller companies. So for example, in like a company with 3 employees will probably not be able to calculate their carbon footprint, right? Or not in a very rigorous way. They might have, 3 founders, all male. Hopefully in the future, they will add more female employees, but there is no point. I mean, we can still track it, and we do, but there is sometimes no point in asking this data to very, very small companies. Rather, our approach is to be along the journey with them as they grow and make sure that they have the right policies, the right strategies to be able to comply, to be able to not just, report on ESG, on sustainability, but increase their thresholds and their ambitions on those targets. And I think that's what a lot of also investors, companies, funds, banks perhaps miss a little bit, that it's not just about reporting, like we are doing this to actually make an impact.
Melina, so you have your own criteria as well, and of course you are only investing in companies if you know that something sustainable, something is going on. So is it really, if the companies know that they need to report, for example, to you or as well to the DKB, we need to report our sustainability information anyway. Is there really a big gap for small companies that we have to close through a regulation, or is it going anyway in this direction because funding is given away more with a focus on sustainability?
So we do ask for data on an annual basis, right? So we do ask for impact KPIs, we ask for, again, the principal adverse impacts, but a company that has, as I said before, like 3 employees will not have, or it doesn't even make sense for them to report on an adjusted gender pay gap, right? And so in terms of the framework itself, I think it works for larger companies. I think that investors should help companies as they grow meet those standards over time. So I'm not saying that we should lower the standards, change the framework. It's just who it applies to and at which moment in their growth journey. And that's where we come in, basically.
Can you help there as well, Katharina?
Yeah, I think maybe that was a misunderstanding, because I definitely actually said that we should look into selected things that make sense. That's what I said before. And for example, with regards to climate, I mean, if you invest in companies with an impact focus, as you just said, you are tracking KPIs on impact. And what does the CSRD do? They suggest KPIs to track impact. And yes, it's a very broad spectrum, and the suggestion and the thought that I would like to suppose here is that we look into a harmonization of few selected things, like for example CO2, and that the impact KPIs that you then ask are somehow aligned, if it's a climate impact, as well with the KPI definition, and that gets very detaily, I'm sorry, but it's always important if you measure a percentage or an absolute reduction or whatever, and somehow it should be similar so that investors who look into, or banks who look into a CO2 KPI can compare both the one of your 3 male founder thing as well as the one with the 500 employees larger wind farm project. I'm just looking to also with a very, very sound target to reduce effort, yet to harmonize somehow. I mean, and that's the whole issue, or that's the whole ambition of the EU regulation, to somehow, out of the, I think, 15 different ways to report over 100 sustainability or even more KPIs, to somehow harmonize it. And then now I think we should need to boil down a little bit. What is the, let's say, first step with very, very few KPIs for smaller companies? And I think climate is the area where we should start. Yeah, it's measurable. It's the most advanced one. And there we should see if we can have maybe a little bit of a steps approach. Yeah, start with a few, but that are comparable to the ones that also the larger need to report anyway, so it can be easily harmonized. And talking about digitalization, it can be easily, let's say, integrated into reporting software, etc., reporting and assessment, and then steering software.
Yeah.
Elisabeth, harmonization, EU level, that's, I think, something for you. You're traveling between Berlin and Brussels. What's happening in Brussels? Is there harmonization coming? What do we have to expect?
Harmonization with regards to what, in general, in sustainability, or all the subjects that we already talked about?
Just what Katharina said. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think all of the legislation that we already covered today, some of them are ongoing, so it's not fixed yet, and that's the beauty about the EU legislative process. There's a lot of wheels spinning at the same time, and I think that there's a lot in motion, but the issue we have currently is that the European Commission will be renewed next year, so there will be a new commission, and my personal feeling or impression is that they're trying to get the last files out of their way, and then the whole process and the campaigning, everything will start already. So I think we have a bit of a limited time frame currently in order to get the files that are most important through. Nonetheless, I do sense certain urgency when it comes to the climate topic still, and sustainability. I think it's on everyone's agenda, quite on the top as well, and that's my personal hope as well, that it will continue. It's not easy, especially because of the whole geopolitical situation that we are in, but my impression is that everyone's doing their hardest. But as we all know, it takes a lot of time, and I think for us as the industry, sometimes it's not fast enough. So we're oftentimes waiting for the important definitions that I mentioned earlier, but there's all of these institutions involved. So yeah, I hope that answers your question to a certain extent.
Sure, and I want to end this block of regulation with one question on the green asset ratio to all the three of you. And I think one important thing we try on those conferences always is to look where can we find consensus between politics, between corporates, between impact funds like yours, Melina. Green asset ratio, should we just include everything? So every windmill there is, or should there be still a threshold?
I would say we should include everything because it gives a certain incentive to smaller companies as well. Maybe there could be a system where you have a classification system, so it's a proportional way of showing it. Because ultimately, even banks financing nuclear energy are part of it. So I think transparency is the key here. We should be able to let everyone show their sustainable efforts, but also the ones that are sustainable according to EU criteria, which maybe from a German perspective isn't even that sustainable when we talk about nuclear. So my answer is yes.
Melina?
I agree with Elisabeth. Transparency is key to be able to distinguish the investors and asset allocators that are really making a meaningful strive towards sustainability. But I think that there are minimum standards that everyone should comply with. From the venture capital side of things, that's already happening with SFDR, with Article 6, 8, and 9. And I think it's especially for limited partners, so for those institutions that are providing money to venture capital funds, it's a good way of distinguishing the different practices within venture capital funds around sustainability. I think that we need to be cautious about not over-regulating and continue with a complying and explain approach that SFDR has, especially for venture capital funds, because it does provide a little bit of flexibility for, again, companies that might be smaller. But in general, to go back to the first part of the question, I think, yes, transparency as well is key.
Katharina?
Yes, I mean it's a bit absurd that a very, very large part of future energy supply couldn't be disclaimed as sustainable or green if it's green just because it's too small. I mean it's even medium-sized, so it's a bit absurd. Actually, in the beginning when I heard this effect, I was like, can it really be like that? And therefore, it should, of course, include all investments and all debt funding to, for example, renewable energies should be included in the green asset ratio. Then we do have the issue, though, I want to make that very transparent, that then the information needs to be provided. Yeah, but then as said, at the moment we have a climate thing, and maybe the climate information is anyway something good to somehow know, as well as an SME. But that's then what would happen if everything would be included. But on the other hand, otherwise it would be an incorrect market information, this green asset ratio, and we wouldn't want that either.
Perfect. Switch now to the topic implementation and data. So we have the regulation now. Now we need the information, and information is data in the digital world. Maybe first to you, Melina, do you have any problems or lack of data, lack of quality of data when measuring impact or when going to making investment decisions?
I mean, absolutely. We cannot lie about it, right? A couple of data issues. So first of all, again, small companies don't have the resources to collect a lot of the data early on. And so we put mechanisms, for example, in our shareholders agreement to make sure that as they have more resources, they are able and committed to collecting that data. So that's one part of it. The second part, a lot of new technologies out there are so innovative that there is not enough data. For example, a lot of climate technologies, especially on the hardware or biotech side, require life cycle assessments to know if they are climate positive or not. When you have a new technology that hasn't done that study, you cannot be 100% positive whether that's going to be something that falls under your investment criteria or not. And so again, you need to use other data points, whether are proxies, for example, from academic research, talking to technical due diligence providers, experts, to be able to fill in those gaps. But just like venture capital is an industry where we take risks, to a certain degree, we also take impact risks. Those need to be accounted in our impact analysis, and they need to be updated, and there needs to be also ways to, if as we learn more, we have more data, and that data doesn't look impactful, to also be able to correct that and to potentially steer the company towards a more impactful direction. So there are many ways where we have data quality problems, but the important thing is to have those mechanisms in place so that you can update your analysis, you can also support the company over time.
You mentioned that some of the tech you are investing in is too innovative. Do you have an example?
Too innovative in the sense, I mean, there is nothing too innovative per se, but innovative in the sense that it might be a completely new technology where, it comes out of the university, there is, a little bit like 1 or 2 academic papers about it, but that's it, right? And with those academic papers, you might not have the full picture and all the information that you need to 100% be sure, which again, in our industry, there's nothing, you can never be 100% sure of anything, because it's just a risky asset to begin with, to be able to make definitive decisions about impacts, return potential, etc. So that happens quite frequently when you are investing in early stage companies. And early stage, I mean, pre-seed, seed, sometimes even Series A, right? If you invest growth stage, that's a different story.
Elisabeth, you have similar problems. I think you are doing investments in maybe quite a bit different scale sometimes. Is it similar or are the problems different?
It's a bit different. I do think that the subject of lack of data, that's a similar issue that we have. I think in general, it's also an issue for consumers. How can consumers make the right choice if there's no data available? But for us, the main issue is when it comes to the subject of buildings, actually. So we are obliged to, assess the sustainability of buildings, and financial players have huge issues with that to meet these sustainability reporting requirements, because we don't have a concrete database in Germany. We don't have a data landscape or an infrastructure when it comes to the energy of buildings and how sustainable buildings are, to rate the energy efficiency. And we believe that that's something that could be quite easily introduced. I mean, there's ongoing legislation on energy efficiency of buildings on EU level, but we think that, especially with the implementation of EU legislation, that sometimes it takes a while. So we think that from a German perspective, that's something that could easily be done with something like a data hub, where we have all of the data together, and we can, all create a level playing field where we can access the important data without breaching privacy issues, in order to be able to classify buildings so that we know what we actually invest in, because otherwise there's kind of a black box for us as well. It's something that we really struggle with, and it's sometimes impossible to get the data because it's just not there. Because they don't need to certify their buildings in Germany. So it's very different to what you just mentioned, but it's the lack of data, I think, as an overall problem that we face.
Of course, the building lobby also doesn't want to report the data. That's the things we need to somehow balance out. On the other hand, so the same approach here, I guess, the data that is really relevant, yes, and then look at what might not be needed, yeah, and in order to make the effort that is there, yeah, that needs to be acknowledged when you track data, but then that the benefit in order to get to new business models that really enable the cool transition towards climate neutrality or even positivity, etc., or circular economy. There's also a lot of digital potential there. So that somehow the effort and the benefit weighs out. So we need the data, yes, and we need to see how it's better. It's even ongoing German regulation. Then, in addition, regarding tax, I'm in the financial committee, and we don't only talk about regulation, but also on tax incentives. And we right now are discussing how, for example, in the building sector, we could make better incentives for green building transformation. I wanted to add something about the data. I think both of you also mentioned the term impact. And when we want to have positive impact in environmental or social aspects, it's of course very relevant to get a sound basis of information. And there, I mean, maybe some of you know that I've been long working for a digital technology-oriented large consultancy and been working there on sustainability. And I'm totally convinced of the huge potentials as well that are there when you look into life cycle analysis that has been done a lot in Excel sheets and a lot of very, very large calculations that you can somehow merge the existing knowledge and get a quicker and better and then even more reliable and also easier to steer approach in order to get true impact data, which is the important thing to change things. And that is one thing that the time is running out. That is really an important message I want to make. There's a lot in sustainable finance around that is a bit trial and error, ESG screening, etc. A lot of work being done with no impact. Yeah, to be honest, it's very hard to say it, but you can't really know if you changed something on the ground. Yeah, you have a bit of more information. It's good to have more information, but we don't know yet if the large-scale amount of ESG funds, for example, really changes something. On the other hand, it changes thinking, so it might change something on the ground. And then there's a very small proportion, less than 4% of the Article 9 real impact funds that really do make a difference or should make a difference. And this is where we need to get more to, I think, to start with the data and understand on the ground. Now we have less CO2 emitted or more resources kept in the loop or something like that. And this is where I think digital technologies can help us very much in better understanding not only the financial, but also the environmental and the social impact.
Almost a great closing statement, but one last question. And maybe you have an answer for that then, Katharina, or a reply. What is, if you have your next step and you have one wish how politics could help you to realize that step to become even more sustainable regarding your investments, what could help you the most at the moment?
So one would be flexibility. And again, I come obviously from one part of the financial sector where a lot of this regulation, sometimes feels more of a burden on the operational side than an actual, contributor. And I think that SFDR does go there and does get there, but just upholding the values of flexibility for the different use cases of these sustainable regulation, and then clarity. There are a lot of things in the regulations that apply to us that are not fully baked. So, for example, before when we were talking about sustainability objectives like climate mitigation, climate adaptation, circularity, only a few of them have very specific criteria, so specifically 2 out of 6. And so when you are trying as a venture capital fund to be able to, again, measure impact at the company level, but you don't have those criteria, those thresholds, well, the job is a little bit more difficult, right? And same for principal adverse impact, so more of the ESG part of the regulation, where the European Union is still adding more PAIs to the pod. And first of all, we need to keep up with regulation. As a small fund with few people on the team, it's difficult to be reading perhaps what's happening on a daily basis, just like, when a bank has, a whole team that works on policy, right? So it's a little bit difficult and definitely different. But also, again, like a lot of these PAIs don't apply to smaller companies. So having clarity around what's coming, what's applicable to smaller companies or not, definitely is something that from the venture capital early stage side of things is very important.
Elisabeth, short statement from you. We are already over time.
Yeah, I mean, if I had one free wish, it would have been the green asset ratio. We discussed this extensively, so that would be ideal. But I think it goes hand in hand with transparency. I think that's even connecting to the topic of the lack of data. If we have more transparency, consumers can make better choices. We can make better choices as the industry, and we can all move forward into the right direction of being more sustainable as a whole. And I do think that that can only work when politics and the private sector work together. So that would be my wish.
Katharina, working together, politics and private companies, is that also your way forward?
Let's say that's the enabler to have regulation that people want to apply in companies. So that's, of course, very important. I do believe very much as well in focus and impact. And so we do have the very broad approach of a corporate sustainability reporting directive and through materiality that can then be focused. But then you sometimes get very broad, and it's important to look into everything. But we, as you said in the beginning, not only myself, but the whole coalition wrote down in their coalition treaty that we want to be a leading place for sustainable finance. And so one thing that is very focus and impact oriented is that we want to include only CO2, because it's the only monetizable KPI, into as well financial reporting standards. And that is something we work on. That is something that would be a little shift, but easy, just one indicator, and would have probably, at least in the climate domain, a large impact. And that's something we work right now on with standard setters, small, large companies, etc. It's something where we think this could be something we could be leading. We work together with the International Accounting Standards Board, etc. And that's something I'm really excited about, that this coalition, and here we are really joined, wants to be also quite focused on one thing that is implementable, and now we work there on the details so that it really makes fun as well for small and large companies together in dialogue, but also with true impact.
Thank you. Thank you, Melina. Thank you, Elisabeth. Thank you, Katharina, for that great, interesting panel. I already see Sarah wants to jump in. And yeah, thank you also for listening, and have a great conference.